Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive.
Yeah.
Today we're going to be looking at Canada-U.S. trade relations,
Right.
and specifically kind of what's been going on in 2025.
Yeah.
It's February 2025,
Yeah.
and things are heating up again,
As they always seem to do.
as they always seem to do, right?
Yeah.
Never a dull moment when it comes to Canada and the U.S.
Exactly.
So yeah, we're going to be talking about trade.
Right.
We're going to be talking about, well, actually, let's just get right into it.
Okay.
So President Trump
Yeah.
has suggested that Canada just become the 51st state,
Hmm.
saying that it would mean lower taxes for Canadians and better military protection.
Interesting.
What do you make of that?
Well, it's certainly a provocative statement.
Yeah.
And, I think it kind of taps into this long and complicated history of
Yeah.
economic and political dynamics between the two countries.
Right.
President Trump has repeatedly kind of framed Canada as taking advantage of the U.S.
Yeah.
He cites trade deficits, restrictions on certain American goods and services.
Right. Yeah, the trade deficit is a big one.
Yeah.
I remember seeing that in 2023, the U.S. reported a $64.3 billion deficit with Canada.
Yeah, and that's actually a really important point to bring up because that is the figure that's reported by the U.S. Census Bureau.
Okay.
But President Trump actually claims that the real deficit is much larger.
Wow, really?
Yeah, so there's already a discrepancy
Yeah.
in just how the numbers are being presented and interpreted.
Right, so it seems like it's not just about the numbers themselves.
Exactly.
It's about how they're being used.
Exactly, and how they're being framed, right?
Right.
Because ultimately they can be used to support different agendas.
Absolutely. And it's not like Canada's just silent on this.
No.
They're not just taking this lying down.
Right.
Canada's UN ambassador, Bob Rae, has been pushing back pretty forcefully
Yes, he has.
on this idea that this trade relationship is one-sided.
Yeah.
He argues that we need to look at the bigger picture.
Mm-hmm.
Things like the flow of services, tourism, Canadian investment in the U.S. create a much more mutually beneficial situation.
Absolutely. It's not just about
Yeah.
who's buying more physical goods from whom.
Right. It's more nuanced than that.
Exactly. And it gets even more complicated when you start to factor in things like tariffs,
Right. That's Harris.
which have been used repeatedly
Oh, yeah.
as a negotiating tactic.
Those were big news.
Yeah,
It felt like things were almost escalating to a full-blown trade war.
it really did. Yeah. I mean, just a few months ago, President Trump threatened to impose a 25% tariff
Wow.
on a whole range of Canadian goods.
Yeah.
And it really seemed like things were about to get really ugly.
Yeah.
But then Prime Minister Trudeau agreed to some concessions,
Okay.
and that led to a 30-day pause on those tariffs.
So it was like a game of chicken?
It really was high-stakes poker.
Yeah.
But yeah, ultimately they managed to avert a crisis, at least temporarily.
So what were those concessions?
Well, Canada agreed to increase border security,
Okay.
specifically targeting the flow of illegal opioids, like fentanyl, which has been a major concern for the U.S.
Yeah.
They also agreed to appoint a so-called fentanyl czar
A fentanyl czar.
to oversee these efforts, which was a key demand from the Trump administration.
Wow.
So, it was a significant concession on Canada's part.
Sounds like it, yeah.
And it just goes to show how high the stakes are in this relationship.
Right. And even with this kind of temporary truce, it sounds like Ambassador Rae isn't a big fan of using these tariffs as a negotiating tactic.
He's been very vocal about that.
Yeah.
He argues that tariffs are a very blunt instrument.
Right.
They disrupt markets, they hurt both economies in the long run.
Yeah, it feels very much like a scorched earth kind of strategy.
It can be, yeah.
And with the current trade agreement set to expire in 2026,
Right.
this all feels very much like just the beginning of a much longer saga.
I think that's a great way to put it. Yeah, this is not the end of the story.
This is just Act 1.
Exactly, Act 1.
So stay tuned, folks, because things are about to get a lot more interesting.
Definitely a lot more to come.
All right, we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back to dive even deeper into this fascinating and complex relationship between Canada and the U.S.
Sounds good. Yeah, it does feel like we're just setting the stage for, another big showdown
Right.
as we get closer to that 2026 deadline.
Yeah, so as we're kind of looking ahead, what are some of those issues that you think might flare up?
Well, I think the trade deficit is going to be a big one.
Right, of course.
That's almost guaranteed to be front and center.
Yeah.
And I think President Trump's focus on, reducing that deficit could lead to some pretty aggressive demands.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Well, he might push for, further opening of Canadian markets.
Okay.
Or even quotas on certain Canadian exports to the U.S.
So it's like that America First approach to trade is still very much alive.
I think it's safe to say that, yeah, And, this isn't just about manufactured goods.
Right.
Energy is another area that could become a flashpoint.
Really? I always thought of Canada as like a big supplier of energy to the U.S.
Oh, they are a major supplier of oil and gas to the U.S.
Right. But it's not without its complications.
Okay.
President Trump has expressed concerns about some of Canada's energy policies.
Like what?
Well, he argues that they unfairly restrict American companies
Okay.
from, accessing Canadian resources.
So we could see like pipelines and infrastructure become part of this whole trade negotiation.
Absolutely. I think that's a very real possibility.
Yeah.
And then there's agriculture.
Right, agriculture, of course.
The U.S. has long been critical of Canada's supply management system.
For dairy and poultry.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They argue that it, protects Canadian farmers
Right.
at the expense of American producers.
So a lot of potential for things to get heated.
Definitely.
But are there any areas where you see like potential for cooperation?
That's a good question. I'm glad you asked that because it's not all doom and gloom.
Right.
Despite the headlines, there are areas of mutual interest
Okay.
where, collaboration could actually deepen the relationship.
Okay. Like what?
Well, the digital economy is a great example.
Yeah, that makes sense. Both countries are pretty tech forward.
Right.
They're leaders in innovation.
Yeah.
And there's a strong shared interest in things like promoting cross-border data flows,
Okay.
making e-commerce easier,
Right.
and generally harmonizing the rules of the road for the digital economy.
So instead of fighting over like widgets and stuff,
Right.
they could actually be working together to shape the future of the digital world.
Exactly. And, that's not the only area where we might see some progress.
Okay. What else?
Environmental policy is another one.
Really?
Yeah, both countries are facing similar challenges when it comes to climate change
Of course.
and the transition to a cleaner energy future.
So maybe instead of tariffs on lumber, we'll see joint ventures on solar panels or something.
It's not out of the realm of possibility. There's a huge opportunity to work together on developing new technologies,
Right.
promoting sustainable forestry,
Yeah.
even aligning carbon pricing mechanisms.
So there's a chance that these trade talks, even with all the potential for conflict, could actually push both countries toward a greener future.
I think that's a very insightful way to put it. And then, of course, let's not forget about security.
Right.
The U.S. and Canada share the longest undefended border in the world.
Yeah, that's true.
And there's a long history of collaboration on things like law enforcement, counterterrorism, border security.
Right.
So that pre-existing trust, that shared interest, could potentially spill over into the trade realm as well.
Okay, so it seems like there's a pretty wide range of potential outcomes here.
Definitely.
Things could get better, they could get worse, or maybe it'll be some kind of weird mix of both.
Probably.
But either way, these negotiations aren't happening in a vacuum.
Right.
There are all these other things happening in the world.
Exactly. The global context is crucial here.
So what are some of the external factors that you think could influence how things play out?
Well, the overall health of the global economy is a big one.
Right. If things are going well, everyone's happy. But if there's a downturn.
Exactly. If we see a slowdown in global growth,
Yeah.
or if protectionist policies start gaining traction in other parts of the world, that could make it much harder
Right.
for the U.S. and Canada to reach a mutually beneficial agreement.
Yeah, because everyone's going to be looking out for themselves.
Exactly. It creates a much more zero-sum mentality.
Right.
And then there's the elephant in the room, or maybe we should call it the dragon in the room.
Oh, the U.S.-China relationship.
Exactly. That's another huge wild card.
Yeah.
If tensions continue to escalate between those two superpowers,
Right.
Canada could find itself caught in the middle.
Oh, yeah. Forced to choose sides.
Exactly.
It's like a big geopolitical tug of war with Canada stuck in the middle of the rope.
That's a great analogy. And then, of course, you can't forget about domestic politics.
Right.
Public opinion matters.
Well, true.
Canadians are increasingly concerned about the impact of trade disputes
Yeah.
on their jobs and their livelihoods. So how the Canadian public perceives these negotiations could have a big impact on how Prime Minister Trudeau approaches them.
So it's not just what happens at the negotiating table.
No, it's much broader than that.
It's about what's happening on the streets and in people's homes.
Exactly. It's this complex interplay of economics, politics, and public perception.
Right. And that's probably what makes it so difficult to predict what's going to happen.
Exactly.
So for someone who's maybe not, following every little detail of this,
Right.
what's the best way for them to kind of make sense of it all?
I think the key is to try to resist getting swept up in those day-to-day headlines.
Okay.
And instead focus on understanding the bigger picture.
The long game.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Look for the patterns, the historical context, the underlying motivations
Okay.
driving the actions of both governments.
And that's kind of what we're trying to do here.
Right? That's exactly right.
Give people that context.
Yeah, help them understand the complexities.
Yeah, make it a little bit more digestible.
And as we head into these crucial negotiations,
Yeah.
it's going to be even more important for everyone to engage in an informed way.
Because it affects all of us,
It does. It affects our jobs, our economies.
our future.
Exactly. And it's fascinating to think about how Canada is going to navigate this new landscape.
Right.
Can they maintain those close economic ties with the U.S.
Yeah.
while also asserting their own interests and values
Yeah.
on the world stage? I mean, that's the million-dollar question.
I guess we'll have to wait and see.
We will.
But in the meantime, we're going to take another quick break. And when we come back, we're going to be diving even deeper into the historical context of this relationship to try to understand how we got to where we are today.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. You know, we've been talking about all this stuff with the U.S. and Canada,
Right.
but I think it's important to kind of zoom out a little bit
Yeah.
and look at the historical context of this relationship.
I think that's a really important point. You know, sometimes we get so focused on the day-to-day headlines
Yeah.
that we lose sight of those broader patterns. So, like, help us zoom out. What are some of the historical dynamics in this relationship?
Well, one thing that really stands out to me is this kind of inherent asymmetry
Right.
between the two countries.
Right.
You know, the U.S., with its sheer economic size and global influence, has always held this dominant position relative to Canada.
Right. It's like that classic older sibling, younger sibling kind of thing.
It really is like that.
Yeah.
And throughout history, you see that dynamic play out in different ways.
Right.
Canada has often had to make concessions,
Yeah.
you know, compromise its own interests in order to maintain good relations.
It's like sleeping with an elephant. You have to be careful every time it rolls over.
Exactly. But it's not a simple story of dominance and subservience.
Right.
You know, Canada has also shown incredible resilience.
Yeah.
They've managed to carve out a distinct national identity, build a thriving economy,
Right.
maintain a high standard of living,
Right.
all while living right next door to the world's most powerful nation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a delicate balancing act for sure.
It really is. It requires a lot of diplomatic finesse.
Right.
You know, Canadian diplomats have historically had to be masters of soft power, building relationships, finding common ground,
Yeah.
advocating for their interests without provoking a backlash.
But it sounds like something's changed.
Well, President Trump's approach to trade, with its emphasis on confrontation and zero-sum games,
Yeah.
has definitely thrown a wrench into that traditional balancing act.
Right. It's a much more transactional approach.
It is, yeah.
It's like the rules of the game have changed.
Yeah.
And Canada's still trying to figure out how to play.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, you know, it raises some fundamental questions about the future.
Right. Like we were talking about before, you know, those flashpoints.
Yeah.
But are there places where cooperation might be possible?
I think there are. I think the digital economy is a prime example.
Yeah. We were talking about that earlier.
Right. There's real potential for collaboration there.
Right. So instead of fighting over the same piece of pie,
Right.
they could actually work together to make the pie bigger.
Exactly. And that collaborative spirit could extend to other areas as well, like environmental policy.
Right.
You know, both countries are facing the same challenges when it comes to climate change.
Yeah.
Working together on things like clean energy development or carbon pricing mechanisms could be mutually beneficial.
So maybe all this trade tension could actually push both countries toward a more sustainable future.
It's possible. It really highlights the fact that the outcome here is not preordained.
Right.
There are a lot of factors at play,
Yeah.
and the choices made by both governments will have a significant impact.
So as we're wrapping up here,
Yeah.
what's like the one key takeaway you want to leave our listeners with?
I would say pay attention.
Okay.
This isn't just a story about two countries haggling over trade deals.
It's bigger than that.
It's much bigger. It's about the future of North America,
Right.
the global balance of power,
Yeah.
the kind of world we want to live in. The choices made in these negotiations will have ripple effects.
Yeah, it's easy to think of trade policy as something that's really boring,
Right.
but it actually affects all of us.
It does. And it's crucial that we stay informed,
Yeah.
engage in these discussions, and hold our leaders accountable.
Well said. Well, that's about all the time we have for this deep dive into Canada-U.S. relations.
It was a great conversation.
Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.